Good evening, everyone. We're continuing with our progression year by year through this wonderful book, Light Bearer. Wonderful because of the subject. So let us now say a prayer and then we'll continue. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Bless us with the inspiration of your life, your courage, your dedication to Master, that we may live our lives following your footsteps, following those footsteps into the infinite light. Om, peace. Amen. This has been a really marvelous experience for me too, to be able to go year by year through this book, even though, of course, I both lived it and wrote it, just having step by step. In 1983, which is the year that we're on right now, it was a very happy time at Ananda, and I'll talk about that more when we get there. But just when I really began to remember all the things that happened. But every single year that I talk about, every year is just a extraordinary series of events. So let's start with the pictures. I have pictures at the beginning and the end of the program. Those of you who may just be joining or finding that out. The pictures are from the archive that Lakshmi Selby gradually collected. So they're not systematic. They're somewhat random. And so a lot of the main events you're going to hear about are not pictured in any of the photographs, but nonetheless, the pictures give you a feeling for what life was like at that time. So let's start now with them. Okay. Now we are firmly ensconced at what we called still the new retreat, although it was called the World Brotherhood Retreat. Swami asked us, but everyone called it the WBR, which was very hard for me. It was called the World Brotherhood Retreat, or the New Retreat is better. This is the Temple of Trees, is what we called this, which was really literally just an open air forum. And it's located quite close to where the Temple of Light was built just a couple of years ago. But you can see now, just to think about it, that the crowd is much bigger than if you think when we first started in the late 70s, early 70s, when Swamiji was sitting in the Temple of Leaves at the old retreat, there was, you could just sort of touch with spreading your arms out. You could see everybody was there. Now the crowd is beginning to spread. We're not sitting on the ground anymore. We're sitting on chairs. So civilization is beginning to strike Ananda village. Next picture. This is inside now the what we call now the teaching temple, because it's distinct from the Temple of Light. But until 2019, it was the only temple we had there at the farm. Jyotish Devi giving a class on, I don't remember where that altar came from, but somehow we made it and put it there. This is approximately 1983. This picture is not exactly dated. We always had that wonderful statue of Jesus, the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I don't know where it came from, but it was always in the temple at the old retreat, and then it got moved over to the Expanding Light, which at this time was the World Brotherhood Retreat. Next picture. Just me in that same temple. At this point, my life had really turned into giving classes, teaching. I was on the retreat staff. I did lots of programs there. And then soon after, this is like after the incorporation project finished, then I began to travel on the West Coast primarily, just giving classes at Ananda groups or unity churches. I started basically the life that I've lived continuously ever since. Next picture. This is just a beautiful picture of our farm, the community. And I'm just keep putting this picture up year by year to show you that the place never changes, at least not that part of it. We were building houses out of sight. I don't have any pictures of the housing clusters, but the so-called downtown Ananda, just here it is again on a beautiful, probably summer day. Next picture. That was the swimming float that we had on Pubble Pond. The publications building, this picture was taken from close to the publications building. There was this pond was created by the construction of a dam, which was either already on the property or we put it on, I don't know which. And when we would walk from Ayodhya, we would walk in from the direction where this picture, where we're looking, we'd walk past those houses and across the dam. And the summer was so hot. Sometimes we'd have our publications meetings out on that raft so we could go in and out of the water when the heat got to be too much for us. And of course, the children remember this quite vividly because it was a great idyllic life we had at that time. Next picture. This is the old retreat with the temple that eventually fell down and the common dome. Those buildings are not standing now. New buildings have been put up in their place, but this is with the Manzanita. This was our home. Next picture. There's that, we used, our gongs were made out of these were propane tanks. You cut the bottom off the propane tank and they made this marvelous deep sound, and all the meals and all the sadhanas and everything was signaled by going out and bashing that big gong with a big padded weight. It was in the sound of that gong reverberating over the property was just became sort of part of your DNA in the whole life that we had up there. Next picture. It's a picture of one of the school classes. Lakshmi was teaching at that point, and Nitai, and just the children who lived there. And we go out for a school picture and just go out into the field. That was the way it was done. Next picture is another school class. This is Papa Louie, and I don't know the woman, the other co-teacher. We had a lot of small children at that time. Nowadays, the school at Ananda Village is mostly children from the area, but for all of these years, these were all resident children. We were educating our own children. We had few or none that were not part of the community. So next picture. And this is this is why. Here are all the pregnant ladies. Ananda had really moved over into being a householder community. And the inevitable result is this. Anne Gornick is on the far right. On the far left, Mantra Devi, Mary Kretzmann. Kalyani's there in red. I'm not sure. Girija, Bhakti, and those souls have moved into other areas of the world right now. Next picture is also the pregnant ladies. It was a baby shower. There was a period of time where there were 8 little boys all born at the same time. I think it must be another year because we have pictures of all of the 8 little boys over the course of a year. So this was, it's Swamiji in 1981 and 82. I was talking about how Swamiji wanted the community to shift over into being a real householder community. By 1983, we were following his lead. Next picture. This is what comes after that, which is the baptism, the baby blessing. And Swamiji was there just blessing the latest crop of children. And this was the spirit of Ananda now. From having been very austere monastics, we were really now becoming a community of families. Next picture is also more babies being blessed. That's little Joya Coombs. I'm not sure the baby next to her, who exactly it is. That's Swamiji with his back to us, blessing the babies. Next picture. Now we're at Ocean Song. Ocean Song the whole time it was there, which was for 7 years, we were still working on it here. It had a sort of, I don't want to say commune because it wasn't really a commune because Ananda didn't live that way, but it was a small family and a wonderful family. The people who were there, it was very sad for the people who lived there when it didn't work out. Front row, kneeling in blue, that's Paula, whom you hear me talk about sometimes because she died relatively young of cancer. Devarshi's in the second row on the left, and right next to him with long hair is Savitri. Anne and Michael Gornick are behind them. Raghu Clark is in the last row, sitting next to, oh, that's Mark Monson, but in front of Mark in the red shirt is Dayanand. I'm naming all the people that you might know because they're still with us. And that was the family there. Next picture. And this is the wedding. Michael and Nan Gornick got married there. And again, I mean, we were marvelously informal, especially at Ocean Song, but everywhere. So this is the wedding. They just went out into the field and everybody sat down on the grass. Durga's conducting the wedding. Next picture is also the wedding. There you can see Dharmadas was best man for Michael. Beautiful. Michael and Ann went on to build Pole Star in Hawaii, which was recently destroyed by lava, and they're looking to rebuild in Colorado at this point. Next picture. This is called the Portland Center. I'm a little confused, quite honestly, but that's what it says on it. The personnel is a little random. In the coral shirt with the white turtleneck and is Sitabai Betts, and behind her is Balarama Betts. In front of her is actually Joe Garceau, who's Sitabai's mother. Karuna and Shoshona with the little baby on the lap. Karuna and Shoshona became the first managers here at Ananda Palo Alto. They were running the house here, and so they were a part of this community. And then Hanuman and Mari are sitting right in front. Maybe they lived in Portland at that point. This whole thing is a mystery. I'm just believing the tag on it that said it was 1983 Portland. Balaram and Sitabai, I thought, lived in Seattle, so who knows? But it's a nice picture. Is this? Well, I was just going to let it sit there. Next photograph. This is me again. Probably 1983. I was beginning to travel, and I started going down to Southern California, where Vasanta and Magi were central to a small meditation group there. And we had a retreat up on Lake Arrowhead or something like that. And this was my life all through the 80s until I moved to Palo Alto. Next picture. Me again, somewhere along the line, sharing master's teachings. So that I remember vividly that life, and there it is. Next picture. This is the farm again, the community master's market, the everlasting white building, which is still there. But this is one of the most attractive pictures I've seen of it. So 1983 was a very happy year for all of us. So I guess it was a happy year for that building too. Somebody managed to make a picture of it that looks very warm and friendly. Okay, next picture. This is the North San Juan Volunteer Fire Department, the Ananda Village contingent. Starting from the left as you look at it, Nancy Mayer, Netri, Vajra, Om Prakash, I don't know who the silver guy is. Far right is Trimurti, and they were on the radio dial, and that orange thing I think was somehow a fire truck of some kind. And I mean, fires were always serious up there, not like what we face now, but fires were serious, and it was important for us to be engaged in protecting our area. So whenever there was a fire anywhere in the area, these folks would be called your basic volunteer fire department. They'd probably jump into that orange vehicle and head off to where they were needed. Next picture. We started jogathons at that point. Now we call them joyathon. Jogathons were sort of a fundraising event in the world, and we called ours joyathons. And we were all much younger, and many of us were runners. So this was just a fundraising day with Arjuna and Dan Swigert. I think Carrie Mayer is back there too. Next picture. This This is labeled Halloween, but I don't think it was Halloween. Leela Devi, who's the heroine in white there, used to love to write these, still does. She loves to write these humorous skits. And as I recall, this was a melodrama. And Agni there on the left was the hero, and she in the white was the heroine, and Lewis Howard in the black was the villain. And then this was, I don't know, probably the barmaid with the heart of gold leaning on his shoulder. I don't know who she is, but I think it was some ridiculous entertainment that was put together for some event or another. And I think it speaks for itself. Next picture. And that's Sudarshan, who I just, and his mustache. And, and he doesn't seem to be in costume, except he's wearing that mustache. And I thought it was worth observing in a photograph. It might have been a special occasion, or maybe that was just his everyday attire. I'm really not sure. Okay, next picture. Purushottama and Pranaba, obviously dressed up for some program that we were giving somewhere. I have no idea. We never dress like that in the context of Ananda. We only dress like that if we were somewhere else for some reason. And I don't know, but it was a good photo. Next picture. This is Durga and Haridas. And actually, as it happens, this was the birth of Kalyani's daughter Mirabai. And so what they're smiling so blissfully at is the advent of the incarnation of that lovely woman. Okay, next picture. We were still having weddings in 1983. This is Anandi and Bharat. Nitai was the best man there. And we were doing a ceremony, the ceremony that Master wrote. A few years later, Swami wrote the ceremony we use now. And we had a fire. We did it in a more Indian way. There was a fire, and the couple walked 7 times around the fire in the Vedic way. Next picture. Swamiji standing with Anandi and Bharat. Now you see Swami's out of orange, and for all special occasions now Swami wears lavender. And everyone began to wear lavender, even if one had never done it before, because Swamiji was putting it forward as the color that had the same vibration as our ray of grace. That was the phrase he uses. So this was Swami's now formal attire. Next picture. This is the last picture in this series, and he was throwing rose petals. And you can see also behind him, that's his mother, Gertrude. I had said Gertrude came over this period of time to 2 different weddings. This was the second wedding. This was the wedding after her husband Ray had died. And Swamiji just looked so blissfully happy. And we'll just stay with this picture and play a song. The moment it slips my mind which one it is, but which one is it? Oh, Nightingale. I've been playing the songs often in older recordings because that was more. I've been playing the songs that were, of course, were written, that were already written by this time. And also I've been playing sometimes the older recordings because it's more the sound of his voice and the feeling of how the music was presented. It got more and more sophisticated as time went on. But at this point, it was simpler. The music wasn't, the music was just the same, but the presentation was simpler. So let's now listen to Swamiji singing Nightingale.
Could you tell them I checked something I need to start this?
We may have to restart the broadcast.
Just the screenshot.
Okay, there's going to be a little messing around, but everything is fine.
Nightingale, nightingale, sing of joy through the night. Teach my heart to impart everywhere your delight. Sing of moon rays on the ring, sing that love's not in vain. Every grief, every wrong has its ending in song. Nightingale, nightingale, sing of joy through the night. Teach all men how to spin clouds of gloom into light. Without silence, what is song? Without night, where is dawn? Were it not for men's woes, who would smile at a rose? Nightingale, nightingale, sing of joy through the night. Let each tone silence grow, earth and heaven unite. Morning laughter, evening tears, snow and blossoms all fade. Joy must sing in the night to face change unafraid. Nightingale, nightingale, nightingale.
All right, my friends. Now you have a picture of what life was like at that point, and now it gets more so. In January of 1983, Swamiji, I mentioned in 1982 when I was traveling with Swamiji in Italy, and we went to Sorrento, and the group of charismatic Catholics that he had met in November of 1981 had invited him down to spend several weeks, I think, in their group. And as soon as he got off the train, Rosanna um, slipped her arm in his arm and stayed by his side for the whole time that we were there. In 1982, Swami went back to Italy once or twice after that June visit. And in 1983, in January, he invited 4 people from the Peki group to come over to see Ananda. Rosanna was one of them. Attilio, who was the leader of the group, a man who was the leader of the group, Attilio's brother, whom I think was called Marco, I'm not sure, and Marco's wife, Loredana. And they were all 4 of them, what was called the pastorale, or at least Attilio and Rosanna were. They were leaders of that group. Also, they were Rosanna, and Attilio, and I'm going to call him Marco because I think that's his name. Rosanna, Attilio, and Marco were cousins. Their mothers were sisters. So the whole Peki group was not only friends in one area, but Rosanna's family and Attilio's family were also integral to it. And I think there were 4 or 5 children in Attilio's family and 3 in Rosanna's. So they were a very large influence in the way the whole group operated. So their coming was Swamiji's feeling on multiple levels. He had a friendship with Rosanna, and a couple of years later they got married. So that was a very important part of it. He was extremely intrigued by the idea that that Master's teachings could be brought into the Catholic Church through this opening that this group Peki provided. Peki was they always wrote it with P-E-K-I, and it was some intuitively received name. It actually means peace, but it's not, I don't think it's modern Italian, is my understanding. It's some other language or some other time and place. Of the 4 of them, I think 2 of them spoke some English. One of them spoke it well. Rosanna spoke almost no English, but she was the heart and soul of the whole group. Now, they wrote a lot of their own music, and they were very, very musical, all of them. And both of the men, I believe, played the guitar. And they had many songs that they had written that they sang with their own guitars in this very free and heartfelt manner. The specialty of the Italian culture has just been to love God. I mean, there's so many saints that come out of Italy, and it's not just because the Pope is closer to them, it's because the culture cultivates it. And Swami said to us, he said, I feel that Ananda can be of benefit to the Peki group. He said, but I think they will be a greater benefit to us. And as he put it, he said, here in America, we get so involved in work, and we get so focused on all that we have to do. He said that we lose that sense of priority, that spontaneous devotion to God is really the reason that we're here. And he felt that just the way that the group, the people from Peki, the Peki group itself, plus the Italian temperament, would bring a necessary freedom of heart to Ananda that he felt was would be extremely beneficial to us. I had this experience much later when I was living here in Palo Alto, and Swami would often come and give satsangs here, and we would just fill our temple wall to wall. We would, the only time we ever really advertised, we had to rent another hall because just word of mouth, their own group would just fill the whole temple. 300 people or 400 people would make it pretty full. Afterwards, Swami would often greet everyone who would come up. And he spoke 8 different languages. And here in the Bay Area, there's all this, there's such a multicultural place. Well, Swami would be standing there greeting people. He would be switching from Spanish to French, occasionally Bengali into Italian, a little bit of German, just as the different nationalities came forward. And I only speak English, so I just had to listen. But I would hear the people who speak English. Thank you very much, Swamiji. That was a really excellent talk. I felt very deeply moved by meeting you. The Spanish people would be a little more lavish. The Italians, it would just be like, bellissima, bellissima, and this huge sort of outpouring. And I knew enough Italian to know that basically all they were saying is just beautiful, wonderful, joy, joy. There was no necessity to sort of say, well, thank you very much, Swamiji. I think that was a really excellent talk. It was just this heart to heart. And as time passed, as you'll see, as I'll talk about this, as Ananda became established in Italy, our whole way of relating to Swami began to shift, because their way of relating to him was so much, they knew how to treat a saint, is really the only way I can think to say it. So here we have these Italian people, and we've just never had anything like this happen. Italians are very personal and very family-centered and very expressive. As I wrote in the book, and as I vividly remember, whenever any of us would see them for the first time, it would be like we'd been separated for a year, and it had to be a very lavish greeting and, kissing on both cheeks and perhaps a hug. And every opportunity that there was to celebrate our friendship and our relationship to each other, these 4 Italian people just took it as the most natural thing in the world. And Ananda was not accustomed to expressing ourselves quite that freely. And it was not to our credit that we weren't. Swami, it was partly, but it was partly because we were Americans. And even though we're enthusiastic, we're a little bit guarded in our hearts compared to the Italians. And, Americans always need to appear to be in control, and the worst thing that can happen to an American is that he's made a fool of. So you're always a little careful. I would find that it's a whole nother subject, but the point being, just a second now, because I changed gears, I have to find the thought again. Oh, yes. And also because our community was so monastic. And because when we're monastic, we were much more restrained with each other because there were always monks and nuns around. You didn't want to be hugging, you didn't want to be kissing. And even married couples did not want to be physically affectionate when there were monastics around, and there were always monastics around. So out of respect for that lifestyle, the whole lifestyle of Ananda became very monastic, which was not necessarily a spontaneous expression of how we felt, but it had gradually become the culture. Now, two things happened. One was the vast majority of people were no longer monastics. There was just a few monks and nuns, but the culture had become householder. Then Swami brought these Italian people over. And this is how Swami put it to us. He says, human love is almost the same as divine love. And he said, too much dryness in our human relationships can also make us a bit dry in our relationship with God. And the other thing that they brought, playing the guitars, created this rhythm in the music, which we had it, but most of our chanting was with harmoniums. So a few people chanted with guitars, but it wasn't the style. And Swami was very reluctant to make a change to something so fundamental to Master's path. But the spontaneity and the liveliness that Swami saw that the guitars brought into the music that Peki brought convinced Swamiji that we should bring guitars into what we were doing as well, which again sort of began to change the whole feeling of what we were doing. And the other part, which was extremely interesting, Peki was very spontaneous. They were not premeditated. They were accustomed to flowing with the feelings of the heart, and they had a way of praying. We prayed out loud. What one person would lead, the other person would. It would be responsive prayer, when in a group, and prayers weren't exactly set, but they were somewhat predictable and a little bit limited. Peki had a custom where, as things would unfold in a satsang, if you felt inspired, you would just begin to pray out loud, not responsively, but just articulating so everyone could hear whatever spontaneous feeling of devotion and reverence was arising in your heart. And none of us had ever done anything like that before. It just wasn't part of our culture. And it wasn't so much that we ever adopted that way of doing it, but what it did is it showed us a kind of intimacy with God and Guru that you could express. I mean, they even expressed it publicly, but at least you could express it privately, in which God was your very best friend and you could speak to him without any inhibition. And they had their ways, in with some of their songs, they would go into quiet instrumentals, and then different ones of them would offer these kinds of spontaneous prayer. So it wasn't like a Quaker meeting where you never knew who was going to speak, but it was sort of at this time, people would share their inspiration. And so because Rosanna didn't speak English, she would pray like this in Italian, and then Swami would translate for us so that we could hear. And so in this way, we began to understand more of who Rosanna was. And also, we began to watch Swamiji and Rosanna interact, because Rosanna would express this devotion in Italian. Swami would speak English, which has a very different sound, but the vibration of what Swami would say in English, you could tell was the exact vibration of what Rosanna had said in Italian. So all of this was, now we had been through, Swami brings Parameshwari to the community. We go through the horrible fight for the incorporation. Parameshwari drops away and doesn't come back. And now all of a sudden, this whole other energy is entering into the community, where now we have many new couples, plus we have many new babies. Rosanna also, and Ananda was Swamiji's way of conducting satsangs and meditations and services. He said he was very fond. He was very willing to talk to children, but he did not feel that he could talk to children and adults at the same time. because the consciousness of children is very different than the consciousness of adults. So we had a segregation in our programs. When Swami was giving a program, the children were not present. Rosanna loved children. Just she loved children in the abstract, not as individual people, but the concept of children. She delighted in children. The more, the merrier. So during the couple of months that they were visiting, all of a sudden the children were completely integrated into the activities we were doing and into the activities that Swami was doing. Not that we changed Sunday service or our meditations, but we added all this interactive time in which the children played an integral part. So again, the spirit of the Italian culture began to be absorbed into the Ananda culture, make the relaxation that the change in Swami's life had created began to permeate all the way through in countless different ways. So it was delightful. It was just quite a delightful time. Rosanna was an angel. Those who were accompanying her were all inspired at that time, inspiring people. Swamiji became Italian. He was learning to speak, or had learned to speak quite well by that point, and he became Italian. And he himself said, somehow Rosanna's presence made him feel more fatherly, was the word he used. So everybody, the relaxation that I talked about before just continued in a really, really nice way. And Swamiji had said after the fire in 1976, when we really needed to rebuild our community, he had called us satsang, and he had said to us, we really have to concentrate on making money. And I talked about that back when I was back there. He wanted us to think about businesses and earning, because we had been devastated on a physical level, and it was going to take a lot of money to rebuild. So now it's 1983, it's 77 years later, and we had accomplished exactly what we'd hoped to accomplish, which is the gross national product of Ananda was over $1 million at that point, which is not that much money considering how much we were trying to do, but was much more than we'd ever generated before. And so Swami wanted to say to us that, we don't need to do this so much anymore. And he wanted to make it very clear. He said, it's not that I want you to stop working. He said, but we need to bring more devotion into everything we do. And that was the whole message of Rosanna coming, and the beginning of what has become. Because when Ananda finally established, when we really finally established a work in Europe, it ended up being in Italy and is presently in Assisi. That was the country and the people where the spirit was the strongest, and this was all part of that. In 1983, also, Swami's father died, and his father died on Shivaratri. I mentioned that when I was talking about it last week a little bit. He stopped taking his medication, and because the doctor said that he would never really get strong again. He'd had a heart attack. He had a very bad year, and then he died. Swamiji said, better to let a person go when he said it would have been far better for his father just to have died with the first heart attack. But that's a whole other question. But Swami, when he has a chance, he mentions that. But when his father when Swami got word that his father was going to just stop all care, it was Shivaratri, which is and so Swami prayed that his father could die on that day, and he did. So it was like practically, I think, within 24 hours, Ray just left the body. A very auspicious time to die. 6 months later, his mother, her caregiver was a woman named Vairagi, a member of Ananda that Swami had asked to go and live with his parents. She lived with him, I think, for about 2 years, maybe 2.5 years. And she'd been away, and she came back, and she found Gertrude Walters was unconscious on the floor, and she just slipped into unconsciousness. they called Swami, she called Swami and said what had happened. Swami felt that he could pray for her as well from Ananda village as he could from um, actually this area where she lived. She never regained consciousness, and 2 days later she passed away. So that mattered because now Swamiji received a substantial inheritance, um, especially in those the dollars of those years. And Swamiji felt he had this moral dilemma that he just wasn't quite sure what to do. In all his years of building Ananda, his father had never given him $1. Never. He never contributed anything to the building of Ananda. And in fact, he often chastised Swamiji for giving all his money away. His father was a very practical man. He was not a pious man. He did not understand a life given to God. His mother understood a life given to God, but his father did not. And he thought Swami's impracticality should not be rewarded. So Swami felt if he took that inheritance and just gave it to Ananda, his father would be uneasy. His father's soul would be restless with that thought. Swami said, if I don't give it to Ananda, my soul will be restless. So he meditated on what would be the ideal solution. And then he came up with the thought of building what we now call Crystal Hermitage. Now, at that time, Swami lived in the dome that you've seen pictures of earlier. And when he was in India in 1977, underneath the dome, they built an apartment. So it was kind of like it was really a ground floor apartment. And the living room was above it. Just the floor of the living room was the ceiling of the apartment underneath. And then he'd also built off to a wing off to one side where he had an office and a recording studio, or I'm not sure. He probably had the recording studio by then. And that was the whole of the place. And there was no garden or anything like that. It was just the woods around it. So he had the idea that he would expand that whole facility, not expand his private quarters, but he would expand the whole place so it could become a community center, and that he would have a place to stay within it, but that he would build gardens, he would build a swimming pool, he would build a big kitchen and a big dining room. And at that time, the kitchen was in the dome. So whenever he had guests, the guests would be talking in the living room and the cooks would be cooking in the kitchen, and they would be about 6 feet apart. So it wasn't a really, the banging of the pots and the water and all of that was always, it made it hard to make a gracious setting. There was no dining room. So whenever there was any guests, you had to move the living room furniture and put up a dining room table. All of it was perfectly fine, but it wasn't where we were going. It wasn't where Ananda was going. And Swamiji explained, he said, especially in America, where money is easier to come by and people have a tendency to want things to be at a certain level of refinement. He said, we have to meet that level of refinement that people expect. He said, not luxury, but just a certain level of refinement, or else they will not believe that our ideas are refined. And so he thought if we had a community center, Crystal Hermitage as it was called, because he realized Swami's dome is what we had always called it, and what he was building was not going to be Swami's dome. So he built the dining room with the library, a very nice kitchen. He built a whole wing on that side. He took down all the partitions in the dome itself so that the whole community could now sit in the dome. When his mother died, he inherited a baby grand piano. He brought the piano into the dome so that a whole, new level of music could be played we could have events there. He had the idea for the terrace garden on one side and the swimming pool on the other, which was built sort of with rocks and a little waterfall. So it was a little bit natural. It was all lovely, absolutely lovely, and accomplished exactly what he wanted to accomplish. It gave us a much more refined environment in which to host, to have events, to come in ourselves. And then as we, but Swami didn't change his living quarters. It's the next year where the story comes relevant, but I'll come back to it. Swami was going to continue to live in the downstairs there. I'll come back to that in a moment. So all of this is going on. We're beginning to build this crystal hermitage, which took a little time to build. Now, there's no expectation yet between Swami and Rosanna that they would eventually get married. It was a friendship based on their mutual love for God, but there was a very close tie between them. Into the middle of all of this, Parameshwari suddenly sort of comes back in this respect. She had gone back to her husband. She'd gotten pregnant and had a child. She was participating in SRF, but the marriage fell apart. And now she's, looking, how am I going to live? How am I going to support myself? And of all things, she turns back to Swami. And she writes to him and says, she wants to come back to Ananda. She doesn't want to come back to be with him, but she wants to come back and live at Ananda. But the way she wrote the letter was, but she wanted him to guarantee that she would have a job and that she would have a house and that she would have a place to live. And Swami wrote back to her in a most interesting way. He basically wrote back to her and said, no one who comes to Ananda looking for personal security ever finds what they're looking for here. He said, I think it would be far better for you you can get a better job in Southern California, to live next to an SRF temple. He said the only way you can live successfully at Ananda is if you're trusting God. He said, even if I were to promise you all this security, he said, who knows if Ananda is going to fail in the morning? He said, I can't promise you a security that I myself don't, that I don't rely on. It's Ananda is for those who want God alone. He didn't say that she couldn't come back. He just refused to respond to her in the way that she wanted him to respond. And that was very interesting, actually. And in the Light Bearer, I comment on this at length. This was not something special that he did just for her. It was, Swamiji's advice was often not as straightforward as it might appear. One of the most important things that we all have to learn on the spiritual path is to have the courage to face ourselves, the courage to know who I really am and what my true capacity is to live for God. We all want to look good. We all want to embrace the highest that we can imagine, but that doesn't mean that we're always able to do it. And especially in regard to Swami, and I myself have had to work my way through this in many different circumstances over the years, to become more and more able to have no need to pretend with him. And there's one particular instance which I do write about in this book, which was most interesting. There was a man in the community who really wanted to see himself as a full renunciate who only lived for God. The problem was he fell wonderfully in love with a very fine woman. And so all of a sudden, the desire to marry her was competing mightily with his self-concept that he was a world-renouncing yogi. So he went to Swami to say, what should I do? And Swami knew that the man's was already committed to this marriage, and there was nothing wrong with him being committed to it, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. So rather than confront him over his weakness, Swami said, I think you should definitely join the monastery. So as soon as that, the force of Swami saying, you have to join the monastery, came right at the man, he immediately responded, but I want to get married, just like that. And it was, it was psychology, but it was also, and then Swami said, fine, I think that would be a good thing for you to do. What he actually said was, I don't think it matters. You can be a monk, you can be a married man, it won't make any difference if you do it with and for God. But I know with me, he also worked with me. Sometimes he would just push you in the false way that you were going until you yourself had to come to terms with it. When I was trying very hard to write about Swami in 2003, which the book ended up being Swami Kriyananda as we have known him, I was trying to write Light Bearer. I was trying to write a biography of Swami. And I just wasn't able, and I was having so much trouble, and I was becoming very dramatic about my failure. It was just becoming a big thing. Swami just finally said, I think you should just give up. He said, I just don't think this is going to work. And he said it like that. And the first part of me was like, I'm relieved. This horrible burden that I've been carrying for so many years. Now I don't have to face it. But as soon as I was allowed that, I heard myself say, no, I have something to say and I'm going to figure out how to say it. And I really don't know if I could have come to that if he hadn't just offered me the out. Because I was writing the book because he had told me to when I was 24 years old. And now all of a sudden he was taking that away. But see, what that also did for me in that context was, why am I doing this? Am I doing this just because I should, because I'm being obedient to someone else? Or am I doing this because I know that this is what I am supposed to do? And that's why when I heard the words come out of my mouth, it was very interesting to me. It wasn't premeditated. Again, it was just spontaneous. No, I have something to say. And it was like, I do. I have something to say. What do you know? And Swami's training of us was so that we could stand on our own 2 feet. It's very hard for people who don't, because there's absolutely no context for it. I mean, a true spiritual teacher makes you strong. No matter how much devotion you have toward that teacher, how much gratitude, how much of your life you'll lay at his feet, because you know that they are the source, they are the source of the grace that gives you the power to do it. And he wrote to Parameshwari like that, and she never wrote back. That was the end. And she joined SRF and actually began to speak against him. That comes later in the story, so we'll wait till we get there. In the autumn, Swamiji went back to Europe to see Rosanna and to visit Peki, and he'd been on a lecture tour in the spring. Also, he was going back and forth to Europe a lot at this time. This was beginning to lay the groundwork for what eventually became Ananda Europa, which was centered in Italy. But in October, he went back. It was not a lecture tour. He really just went back to, I think, to sort of feel out the relationship with Peki. They were trying long distance to figure out how they were going to work together. This was 1983. You didn't have Zoom calls. You didn't have email. Everything was a lot harder to work out at a distance. Telephone calls were very expensive and not really an option. So Swami went over also to just explore. He was holding out this hope, that this would be a real entree for Master's teachings. And so Rosanna and other members of the pastorale came up to Rome. They had some very good meeting of the minds about how they could move forward together. And then after all of that was done, Swami and Rosanna went together to Israel. Now, Rosanna's entire spiritual life was based on Jesus. She was Catholic, and Jesus was the heart and soul of everything that they did. She'd never been to Israel before. Swami had been there once for a very short visit, but this was his first, in-depth pilgrimage there. And afterwards, Swami said, everyone who loves Jesus, needs to go to Jerusalem. And a whole other, we started pilgrimages and so on. And he took lots of pictures, Swami did, of lots of slides of all the different places that he visited. And when he got back to Sorrento, which is where they went back after Israel, Swami began to sort through his slides, and he woke up one morning and a melody came to him, and I'm not sure to which pilgrimage site it related to. Swami had already started writing music inspired by the places he visited. It started with Egypt in 81 when he went on that pilgrimage, that tour of Egypt with Parameshwari. Swamiji experienced the culture of Egypt as it had been at the spiritual height. Now, the culture of Egypt existed in the descending side of the Yuga cycle. So it went from higher to less and less elevated. And so by the time, we know of it, the greatness of it was in the past. When Swami was in Egypt, he felt it at its spiritual height. And then he wrote the Egyptian Suite is what it was called, which was, I don't know, there was just a few songs with lyrics. It was mostly instrumentals, just expressing in music the feeling of that culture. And he also, in his trips to Sorrento, into Italy earlier this year in 1983, he wrote music for his experience in Italy, which he called Mediterranean Magic, which has a few really wonderful songs that have come out of that slideshow and just been part of the repertoire. When he'd gone to Romania a few years earlier, he also wrote songs related to Romania. So this was not unprecedented for him. So he's in Sorrento, and a melody comes to him that expresses musically the vibrations and the inspiration he felt at one of the pilgrimage sites. And Swami's way was he would whistle. It had a little tape recorder, and he whistled the melody into the tape recorder so that he could keep it and save it. And then he sort of opened himself to the idea that, well, if one of the pilgrimage places will express itself to me in music, he said, maybe others will. And he said, in that experience, he received 20 melodies that each was related to one of the holy places that he had visited. So he began to work on combining the slides with the melodies and then writing words for some of the melodies and just beginning to create what eventually became the oratorio. So that was, and Swami then said later that writing the oratorio music was the first time he tried. So much of his music before, especially the songs of divine joy, which he actually even called sermon in songs, that philosophy in music. He said, but with the oratorio, he was really just expressing a vibration, just expressing a state of consciousness. And the music itself would express what the state of consciousness was that he felt there. Now, he doesn't finish the oratorio until 1984. So there's a lot more that I want to say about it as a finished piece of music, but we'll talk about that next session. But Swamiji's hope also was this. Peki, even though there was a certain amount of harmony and they were now practicing Kriya and they had devotion to Master, they also had a very strong theology of their own that was, related to Catholicism, but not entirely. It was also somewhat of their own making. And when we met just as people who love God, there was a great deal of unity. But when it came to Christ, there was a lot of space between what we felt. And so Swamiji also was hoping that by translating the experience of the life of Christ into music, that he would be able to build a bridge that would cross over the theological differences between the two groups. And he also felt that possibly the music of the oratorio, the whole thing, and oratorio is the life of Christ in music, would also be something that he could carry into the churches, and the theology of self-realization to which Ananda was committed would not be the point. The point would just be that there would be this vibration of Christ that would awaken people to a deeper, more inward experience of it. Swami said all of that because he made the interesting statement, which tells you the kind of artist that Swami was. There was a point in time in which a young man who was very musically gifted really wanted to leave Ananda so that he could have his own musical career with his own songs, with his own presentation. Swami suggested to him that if he got deeper into Ananda and into the music that Swami wrote, that he would get deeper into himself, and then the music he would write would be more original and less imitative. But the young man insisted and went forward. He never had a musical career because he wasn't developed enough to do it. But in trying to defend his desire to go on this track, he said to Swami, you know how it is. Sometimes you just have to write a song. And Swami said, no, actually, I don't. He said, I never create out of personal compulsion. He said, I only create when I can serve God by doing so. All that I do as service to my guru. So Swami put out this tremendous effort to write this oratorio beginning now. He did it because he thought it could serve his master's work. And the way Swami put it was, my own inspiration was complete. It was not made deeper by expressing it in music, which is just a very interesting way to say it. And is a lot to contemplate for those of us who are creative and have an inclination to make things happen. Why am I doing this? Am I doing this to serve? Or am I doing this because I'm compelled to, which is not, there's no sin in doing that, but we have to know who we are. And we also have to have Swami's image. I do it because it serves Master for me to do it. And that's why Swami's inspiration flowed effortlessly. There was simply no egoic element to it. It was opening himself. If Master wanted it done, then he would do it. When I say there were no obstacles, there were plenty of obstacles, but there was no internal obstacles. When I was in that period of time of struggling to write, I said something about writer's block. Swami said it like this: I never have writer's block. Just like that. I never have it, because there was no egoic element in his writing, and therefore there would be no ego to block the flow. Sometimes he had to fight, put out the energy and things like that, but not for the same reasons that I struggle. So Swami's working on that. Let me just say what else was here. Oh, yes. Now I'm going to go back just to, but then Swami comes back to San Francisco, and he arrives in San Francisco, and a group of us go down to see him. He takes us right away. He takes us upstairs to his room is on the top floor. There's about 15 of us in the room. We're all sitting in a circle. Swami wants to tell us that he's gone on this extraordinary pilgrimage. He talked about how Rosanna's devotion to Jesus just made the whole trip so deep and so wonderful, and that all these melodies have come to him. And here's the Holy Sepulchre, and here's the Church of the Dormition, and here's the place where Jesus was born, all of this. And he has this little electronic keyboard, this tiny one that's small enough to put into a suitcase, and the speaker is built in. So, I mean, it sounds like a bad harmonica. It's about really what the sound of it is. And he sits there and he says, now here's the Holy Sepulchre. And it sounds like this: ding, 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 like this. And we all knew that when Swami is this elevated and this much in the creative process, the only thing you can say is, wonderful, Swami. It's just wonderful. And later he laughed. I mean, later when it was all sort of okay, we just told him how how crazy it was for us. We'd get, 4 lines of the melody in this terrible tone, and we would have to pretend that we were like back in the place where Jesus was resurrected. Swami laughed because he said, as he hit those notes, he heard the whole piece in his mind. He heard the choir, the instruments, everything. So it sounded to him like it sounded, but not to us. But still, you could feel the inspiration. You couldn't actually hear it, but you could feel that something really extraordinary was about to happen, which did happen. I want to go back now just for this little piece that I didn't say before, which was uh, just one last small thing that happened in '83, which was very important. Swami was working so hard on the oratorio that he needed a rest before he went back to America. But he had promised to give a kriya, and if he took the rest he needed in Europe, he was going to miss that kriya. At that time, no one was authorized to give kriya except Swami Kriyananda at Ananda, and even the fact that Swami continued to give kriya was a great um, wedge between him and his Guru Bhais at Self-Realization Fellowship. They felt that once he was out of SRF, he was no longer authorized to give Kriya. Swami felt that he'd been authorized directly by Master and that no institution could take that away from him. And so at this point, motivated by the fact that Swami wanted to stay in Europe, but unbeknownst to most of us, Swami had already had Jyotish doing private initiations on Kriya. Now he gave Jyotish public authority, and Jyotish conducted that initiation ceremony. I mention that only because one of the subplots that goes through this whole book is Swami's carefully navigating this relationship with his Guru Bhais. And so step by step, Swami just steps into and then moves Ananda into a different dynamic in terms of our direct authority to be Master's children and to do what we're doing. Okay, now the other thing that happened in 1983, which was really fun, I mentioned before how Swami, in one of the earlier sessions, about the satsang that Swami gave in Los Angeles, and when he talked about the characteristically American aspects of Master's work, and one of them was attunement with nature. Well, as part of this whole flow of energy with the Italians coming and us moving more into a familial way of relating to one another, the community had become a little bit too big for everybody to know everybody. So we had this idea that we would create these smaller families within the bigger family, and those groups could meditate together and have events together. And then when guests came, they could become honorary members of one of these little smaller family groups. And that way we could integrate guests into the community. And that in itself was a very good idea. Originally, those little groups were called mandalas, but Swami didn't feel that that was quite the right title. So he meditated on it. And he decided that each of those groups should be nature channels. And each group, they should be created in this way, that each group would take responsibility for attuning itself to a particular aspect of nature and to be a dynamic channel for bringing the power and the vibration of those elements into harmony with human life. Swami was saying that the angelic devas that are in charge of nature were gradually abandoning planet Earth because human beings were so stubborn in not listening to them. The way Swami put it is the devas were abandoning the planet and leaving us to our fate. So Swami thought it would be a dynamic opportunity. One more way that Ananda could give to the world was that we would divide ourselves up into groups, and you would choose the group that you wanted to be, you felt most in tune with. Flowers, trees, stars, rivers, mountains. There might be one more, but maybe it's 5, maybe it's 6. And that you would become part of that channel. And then people automatically chose. I immediately became part of the trees channel because I had always just had this great affinity for trees. Others chose the stars or the flowers as it felt right to them. And then in Swami's way, he wrote a song. And at the end, after we look at some pictures, Swami wrote a song about the channels. And each of those aspects of nature, Swami wrote a verse that tells us what that aspect of nature is trying to teach us about the divine. Because it's not nature that we were attuned to, it's Divine Mother expressed through nature. And each of the verses was separate. And then the chorus, the words of the chorus were the same. Mother, we thank you. Your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing. And a very interesting parallel in Autobiography of a Yogi, Master talks about Adi Shankaracharya setting up the Swami order, and that there were these different divisions of the Swamis, and they were all elements of nature, almost all elements of nature. The forest, the land, the ocean, and the mountains. Yogananda himself was part of the Giri branch of Swamis, which is the mountain branch. And Master even writes that that Adi Shankaracharya envisioned that each Swami would have his monastic name, joy through yoga, Yogananda, joy through Kriya, Kriyananda, whatever it might be, Premananda, whatever it might be. And they would also be an instrument for this particular aspect of nature. And Swami just picked this up and gave it to us again. It's been one of the many, many things that Swami did that we enjoy the song. It's a beautiful song. It's fun to sing. It's in 5-part harmony, all of these different things. But the serious intention of it, Bharat, of course, has picked it up in spades with Sundra coming after him with their whole, earth, sky, foundation, and so on. But as an Ananda commitment, among many, many others, Swami just laid out all these choices that we have the opportunity as time goes by to learn to express. So now let's look at the rest of the pictures, and the song that we're going to hear is going to be the channels song after we look at the pictures. Okay, this is just a lovely picture of lovely people. We're standing outside at one of the outdoor temple areas related to the new retreat. There's Ananta, the tallest man there. Catherine Kairavi, Jyotish and Devi have their backs to us. Diana is standing there. Maria's with her back to us. Probably Vidura off to the side. Okay, next picture. Asha and Seva. I talked this week because Seva just left the planet about a week ago. She was my dearest and best sister. I don't know where I was, but I think I was even at Ananda. I'm holding the same Bible that I still have. So this must have been some kind of class on that subject. I was learning to dress for the public a little bit more now. Next picture. Durga and Jeannie. Just must have been a concert because that was the dress that Jeannie wore when she was doing a concert. Next picture. Lakshmi was on the retreat staff. The bell is right behind her at the old retreat. Next picture. This is Leela, who was Swami Kriyananda's cook. She died, she died about 6 months before he did. She served him for quite a number of years as his cook. And this was probably, she came to Ananda through Ananda House in San Francisco. And she actually ran a catering business. So becoming Swami's cook was just the natural extension of the life that she was living then. Next picture. This is Mangala around this time. Mangala lived in Seattle, and when I started traveling up to Seattle, I would stay with her. I think it was a few years later than this, but it was right at that time. Next picture. Durga and Lakshmi went on a trip to Southern California. This is actually at Lake Shrine. They both were raising children, so I think they took their daughters with them. Next picture. This family is the Bazan family. Margie and Rich, Hashi is what she's called now, and the three children. Rich actually developed ALS and over several years gradually declined and then died in the community. The children were older than this, but nonetheless, it was a young family when he exited from it. He died very bravely and very devotedly. She was very courageous through the whole thing. Next picture. This is Vasanta and Maghi, and they lived in Southern California. They had they were part of this meditation group, and I went down there very often, frequently, stayed with them until they realized that they should live at Ananda Village. After they moved to Ananda Village, I rarely went to Los Angeles because it was really for them that I was traveling. As I traveled around the country, if there was someone there who was really deeply serious about the spiritual path, of course, that would draw me back again and again. So next picture. Well, this is their little group. They call themselves Spirit Song. They came up as a group. Maggie's there just working at the old retreat. Next picture. This is Ram and Parvati, probably at the San Francisco house where they both lived for a time. Next picture. Ram with Leela. She was called Cheryl at that time, but when they went to Europe, I guess Cheryl is a sound that just can't come out in Italian at all. So Swami had to give her a name that they could say easily in Italy, which Leela worked very well, which means divine play. It also suited her. Next picture. This is Michael Herman. Michael Herman has had Parkinson's for many years, but has been extraordinarily courageous and determined in the face of it. This was at the San Francisco house. Toast. All of our Ananda centers run on toast because nobody has time to cook. So much of Ananda has been built on toast from the community kitchens. Next picture. Beautiful of Jyotish and Devi when they were in charge of Ananda House. And it was extraordinarily dynamic. Many great souls came to Ananda through their leadership in that house. Next picture. This is goofiness again. Here we are with the Anandru sisters again. This is Jeannie and her actual biological sister, Lori. And then Jack Wallace playing the piano behind. Next picture adds Uma. And you can see they're all dolled up and they're performing these 1930s hits with extraordinary skill. They were really good at it. The next picture is how Swami responded to their music. And you can see he really enjoyed it. And behind now you can see Lewis Howard playing the drums. He was a rock and roll drummer before he came to Ananda. So when called upon, he could bring that skill out. He learned the tabla later and became wonderfully good at the tabla. This was just Swami commending them for their marvelous performance. Next picture. Now, the rest of the pictures here are this trip. Swami took all these people. We all went with Swamiji to Hawaii. We took like a 2-week trip to Hawaii. I have no idea now how that really came about, but that's what we did. We rented a number of condominiums and we spent a couple of weeks there with Swami. So we have pictures, Nitai, Devi, Jyotish, Seva, me, David, Shivani, Arjuna, Vidura, Durga, Freeman, and Padma. Kalyani was there also, but she was taking the picture. Okay, next picture. Just the girls waiting for the luggage. Who knows what it was? Next photograph. Arjuna and Shivani well, I guess we're sitting behind them. It must have been the bus we were on or however we were getting where we were going. Next picture. Padma and Shivani. We all ended up getting Hawaiian clothes made. Padma and Hriman got that red costume. Everybody else got the same lavender flowered print. So we were indeed quite a sight when we traveled around the islands, all dressed alike in the same Hawaiian print. Next picture. There's Nitai scuba diving. Next. Swami and Seva coming out of the ocean. So this was 1983. It's like all of a sudden we're going off to Hawaii and staying in a condominium and doing stuff like this. I mean, prior to that time, it was just like, it was unthinkable. And then this suddenly became an integrated part of our lives. Next picture. Seva Freeman, who was obviously quite sensitive to the sun, and Swami all dressed up for the occasion. Next picture. Devi and Jyotish again. You know, the women stuck flowers in their hair. I mean, this was also like, wow, we're just living a very different life now. We were being very natural. Prior to that, we were trying to be spiritual. That's what I said last week. We finally stopped trying to be spiritual and we just tried to be ourselves. And Swami was just letting it happen, you know, showing us that it wasn't we weren't separating ourselves from God if we just lived in a way that was natural to our spirit. Next picture. Swami again in his preposterous costume. Okay, next picture. All of these people entered this marathon that was happening on the island, or a half marathon, and they were all very proud of themselves for running and finishing. I'd already retired from running by that point, so I didn't do it. Next picture. And this is the last picture we have. This is Swami on the beach there in Hawaii. This is the chapter photo for 1983. Interestingly, you can see on his right arm the bangle he's wearing, which when he was in SRF, he managed to get a jeweled bangle. It's one of the stories he tells somewhere about having an allowance of $15 a month and ending up with the Navratna, which is 9 stones representing each of the 9 planets. And but he sold it in order to found Ananda. And there was a woman who lived with us for a while who was very wealthy, exceedingly wealthy. And she bought the gold, silver, and copper bangles. She bought like 25 of them and passed them out to all the monks and nuns and to Jyotish and Devi and to all of us who could never have afforded to buy them ourselves. She bought them for all of us. And then when she heard about how he'd sold his bangle, she gave him at that time $10,000 to spend on the bangle. And I had a friend who, I might have told this story before, who could get the stones for us. And then Swami wanted it set in silver, very plain, but the man who got the stones for him wanted it set in beaten gold because he couldn't imagine those beautiful stones not having an appropriate setting. So that's like, it's about 3/4 of an inch wide. And you can see it on his arm there, just barely. So the one on his left arm is the one that Master put on his arm, got for him gold, silver, and copper. Most of the time men wear that bangle on the right arm, but Master put it on Swami's left arm, so he always wore it there. And then when the jeweled bangle came, he put it on his right arm. So now, what I'm going to share with you is a version, a recorded version of the channel song that I talked about. And this one, as it happens, is also a video. Somebody, I don't even know who actually has recorded this, but they made a video of each of the elements of nature that match the song, and they put some instrumental. So it's a very nice expression of what I was talking about, and that'll be the close of our program now.
Birds sing of freedom as they soar lightly on the air. So may our hearts soar high above all curbs and care. Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing.
Trees standing firm, hold the secret of inner power. Give us, when tested, strength to endure. Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing. Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing.
Stars send a message of light through eternity. Lord, when in darkness your radiance we see. Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing.
Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing.
Flowers so soft and fragile, stay fragrant though pressed to the ground. May we thus learn forbearance, for in kindness love is found. Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may see.
Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing.
Mountains remote and still, hinted higher worlds unseen. So may our lives be soaring and serene. Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing.
Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing.
Rivers seek passage unhindered by rock or tree. So may our lives flow steadfast toward the sea. Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing.
Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing. Mother, we thank you, your joy shines in everything. Open these channels that the world once more may sing.